Okay, anatomy students, we are back. So I already talked to you about why sections are important for us to understand. Now let's go through and talk a little bit about what each section is. The first type of section is called a coronal or a frontal section. And basically you're making a cut like this so that you're separating the anterior part of the body from the posterior part of the body. And so in this picture with our patient here, the frontal plane is this purple, it looks like a purple sheet of plexiglass here, going right through the middle of the head, and again separating the front portion of the body from the back, separating the anterior portion of the body from the posterior portion. A sagittal section is going to separate the right and left sides. But if you think about it, you could do a sagittal section that goes right down the center, or it could be a section that maybe lops off like the left arm, or it could be over here by the right arm. So a sagittal section is just going to separate right and left, but there are two ways to describe these sections. If it's mid-sagittal, it goes directly down the center and it divides the body into equal right and left halves. If it is parasagittal, it misses the midline, so it's a little bit off of center. And let's see. The last one is a transverse section, and a transverse section is going to separate the head from the top portion of the body from the bottom portion. So our transverse section is this like green little plexiglass here, and so it's going to separate inferior from superior. All right. So next, let's jump into the body cavities. So body cavities are spaces that are found within our body that contain our organs. They're closed to the outside, they are filled with fluid, and they are lined by membranes that are called serous membranes. Serous membranes are specialized because they contain cells that secrete a fluid called serous fluid. And this fluid is going to allow for organs to change size and shape, and not let them get damaged, because it's going to decrease the friction between the organ and the body wall, for instance, or between one organ and another organ. And if you're wondering, like, well, what organs are going to change size and shape? Lungs, heart, stomach. Anytime that you swallow something, your esophagus is distending and then coming back to its original shape. So there's a lot of movement that's going on in our bodies, and we need to protect the proper of those organs from damage caused by friction and rubbing. All right, so sometimes it's a little bit difficult to really envision what these membranes actually look like, and so I really like this picture here. So here you have a picture of a fist going into a balloon. So it's like the balloon was blown up, and you're just like pressing your fist into the balloon. And then the balloon kind of closes in around your fist. Well, your fist is representing an organ. And then the part of the balloon, the outside of the balloon, that is actually touching your fist, or the membrane that is touching the organ, is called the visceral membrane. So visceral is always touching the organ. Now notice that the balloon is continuous, right? And that is true of these membranes that line the body cavity. So the portion that touches the organ, the visceral serous membrane, and then the part that does not touch the organ is called the parietal serous membrane. And cells that are on the inside here are the cells that are going to secrete a fluid. So in the balloon, it's just the airspace. But in our bodies, it's a very thin space that's filled with this fluid, and it's just going to provide cushioning and protection around our organs and even along our body wall. Now, our trunk, or the torso of our body, is going to contain 3 different regions. We have the thoracic cavity, which is our chest area. We have the abdominal cavity, and we have the pelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity is separated from the abdominal cavity by a muscle called the diaphragm. The abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, however, don't have a physical border. There's just an imaginary line that extends from the back of the pelvis to the front, and that's like the dividing point between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Now, within these cavities, you have even smaller cavities. Did you ever see some of those like Russian nesting dolls, and like you open up one doll and then, whoa, there's another doll, and you open that one up and wow, there's another one? That's kind of how this is. So in the major cavity that we know as the thoracic cavity, we have 2 smaller cavities. The pleural cavity, which contains the lungs, and we have the pericardial cavity, which contains the heart. The abdominal cavity doesn't have any major divisions, and neither does the pelvic cavity. So let's take a look at our thoracic cavity. Here we have a transverse section. So we're looking at a cut that happened like maybe right about, at heart level here. And we have our right lung and the left lung. And the serosa are called the parietal and visceral pleura. So the name of the serous membranes are going to change according to which organ they surround. They're called pleura around the lungs. So our visceral pleura is going to actually touch the lungs. So I'm going to use yellow to show that. And that would go right along here, actually touching the lungs. The parietal pleura would be between the cavity of would be along the body wall of the thoracic cavity. I'll use blue for that. So that's going to be right along here, right along where the ribs are. And then the space in between my blue line and my yellow line is where you're going to have the serous fluid being secreted. And so as you breathe, your lungs are expanding, and then they're returning back to their original shape, and so they're constantly moving, but the outside of your lungs are not going to be damaged because your membranes are preventing them from rubbing up against the ribs that surround them. So they're very well protected. Now, the heart is surrounded almost by a double cavity. So the actual cavity that houses the heart is called the mediastinum. And if we break apart this word, media means middle, and then stinum refers to the sternum. Now, around the heart, you also have serous membranes. We call these membranes collectively the pericardium. So, on the part of the pericardium that actually touches the heart tissue itself, that's called the visceral pericardium. And the part of the serous membrane that forms a bag on the outside of the heart, that is called the parietal pericardium. So the visceral pericardium actually touches the heart tissue, while the parietal pericardium forms a bag around the heart. The mediastinum is also going to contain a mass of tissue that sits right on top of the heart, and it also contains the thymus gland. So our abdominal cavity is sometimes merged with the pelvic cavity, and so the combined name is called the abdominopelvic cavity. Both the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity contain what is called the peritoneal cavity. And so here's what happens. Where's my stylus? Okay. So I'm going to use yellow and blue again. So this blue portion here at the bottom, this is our abdominal cavity. And just like the name of the serous membrane around the lungs is the plural the plural serous membrane, and around the heart it's called the pericardium. In the abdomen, it is called the peritoneum. And so our visceral peritoneum is the one that is going to surround the organs, and it actually touches the organs that are found inside of our abdomen. And I'm going to draw a blue line here that shows us the parietal peritoneum, and that's going to be the part that lines the body wall. And again, the pericardial cavity is what is in between the blue and the yellow line, and that is filled with serous fluid. Now, you'll notice on the slide that I have two structures, the kidneys and the pancreas, that are called retroperitoneal. And the reason why they're called retroperitoneal is because they are not enclosed within the peritoneal space. They are found outside of that blue line. So they are considered retroperitoneal. That's just what that means. Okay, as I mentioned before, the pelvic cavity has an upper border where the upper portion of the pelvic bones are found, and the floor of the pelvic cavity is muscle. It's not completely enclosed by bone. The pelvic cavity is going to contain our organs that are listed here. And notice that we have the distal portion of the large intestine. So that's the part that's furthest away from the beginning. So like the end portion of the large intestine. And then below the peritoneum, so again, these are organs that are not wrapped in the membranes of the abdominopelvic cavity, would include the urinary bladder and then distal portions of the ureters. Those are the tubes that lead from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. So they're carrying urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder, and then also portions of the large intestine. All right, anatomy students, that's all I have for you for this video. Thank you very much for watching them both, and I'll see you in class.